from Parry Architects and London Met. I was just going to do a few words to welcome Carolyn, who is a near neighbour. If I was in London, I'm in rural Sussex, so if I slow down at all, it's because of the village broadband. But let's get on to Carolyn, who, as we were just saying in our chat at the beginning, is first and foremost an architect. So that's how many of you know Carolyn, as either a colleague, somebody who's taught you or you've taught with. And it's really been in the last 20 years that Carolyn has broadened her thinking, and she's a smart one, into the question of really culture and food. And we welcome many of her friends from her new community in the foods, both academic and practical, world out there. I know Carolyn going back to our years at Cambridge, and we just about overlapped, and a trajectory which took her through many years of teaching, a lot with Eric, who's obviously the main host tonight, and really through with a period in Rome at the British School in the mid-90s. But I think the theme as of today is really that thinking on food, which really started in about 2000. So as Carolyn says, 2 decades, with 2 really important books as the product, as well as all of the interfaces with academia and other bodies. So the big hitters, Hungry City in 2008, which I think is now into 8 or 9 translations, we think, Carolyn. And then and most importantly, Sitopia, which was published just before the first national lockdown. So I have to say that Carolyn has been basically broadcasting the book, Tome 2, as it was affectionately called, since then from her living room overlooking Marylebone Station in central London. And today we're looking forward to hearing more. It's not going to be the précis of the book, I don't think, so we look forward to her talk. So welcome.
Thank you, Robert.
So I'm just going to give a couple of notices before handing over to Eric, who will chair the event. As I think many of you know, this is the 3rd in the series called The Living Memory of Cities that we are absolutely thrilled to be co-producing with Eric Parry Architects, and specifically with Jose de Paiva. And Eric has chaired all the events so far, and hopefully going forwards will continue to do so. But we have already got 6 events lined up, and we're looking to have a lecture discussion session once a month going forwards. So I will put into the chat box the link for the listings. Please do all pass on news about this series to your friends. We see this very much as a kind of conversation between friends. An old friend and colleague said that it feels a bit like a club, this event, and in a way that is what we want it to be. We want it to be people who feel that they belong together and are happy to be having a conversation rather than simply a public event. So I was quite happy with that comment, but by the same token, when we get to questions at the end, please do all chip in and put your hand up if you want to speak. I think, as is usually the case, we from the London Met side of things, and specifically the Centre for Urban and Built Ecologies, which is headed up by Nick Temple, who's here, we will lead on the questions. But of course, everyone is very much welcome to become part of the conversation, and hopefully we will have a lively chat at the end of it. I just wanted to say one other thing, that as well as the forthcoming events, which, as I said, I will put the link in the chat bar, we also welcome you all to the launch of our joint research, the joint launch of our research centres at the School of Art, Architecture and Design at London Metropolitan, which will be on the 25th of February. And we will advertise it through social media, the usual channels. But this is to celebrate the launch of our 2 research centres, the Centre of Urban and Built Ecologies, and also our centre called CREATURE, which is the acronym. I'm not sure what it stands for. I'm not going to try. It's something about art, design, public performance, and general creativity in the world. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Parry to start us off.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thanks, Matthew, and Robert's made a very lovely introduction. So I just, by way of pointers, you know, I think amongst the plenitude of excruciating news, not least having to listen to Donald Trump, but closer to home, the photograph posted yesterday by Roadside Mum of the rip-off school meal. And the pure theft of that, you know, actually, and all that it obviously is the tip of an enormous iceberg socially, brings me to, you know, the pivot, as she calls it, of Sitopia, the question of food and society, which is so much at the heart of this. So, and I think the other side, just from a creative point of view, and where the two rivers of your colleagues and friends come together, is very eloquently put in that you make clear that in structuring the book, of thinking through the ideas, you were drawing and you were thinking, you know, spatially to order what is a very, very complex and all-encompassing set of ideas. So I just wanted to make those 2 points, just to focus on the importance of this and how well it follows on from David Leatherbarrow's question of the whole and Peter Carl's enigma of embodiment. So delighted, really a privilege to have you with us, and look forward to picking up at the end of your talk.
Well, thank you so much, Eric, and for those lovely, generous words, and also Robert and Matthew and Nick and Jose. It's really a huge pleasure to be here. And I can't think of a nicer audience to speak to, and I just wish we were all in a room together, but I promise as soon as it's possible, I'm going to have an enormous party and invite you all, so we'll make that happen. But meanwhile, let me attempt in what I hope will be just shy of an hour, but knowing myself probably will be an hour, to indeed explain in a way why I had the temerity to give my most recent book the subtitle, How Food Can Save the World. And indeed, for those of you who don't know what Sitopia is, I'm going to attempt to explain that too. So I shall sail merrily on, assuming that you can all see me and hear me and all the rest of it now, and presumably someone will phone me if you can't. So yes, this is my book Sitopia, which indeed came out the same week that the global pandemic was declared, which felt at the time like very non-ideal timing, but actually subsequently has seemed bizarrely quite fortunate, because I've effectively spent lockdown, as Robert said in his kind introduction, sort of talking about it to people via this extraordinary medium of the internet, and it's non-accidental in a way that there is this kind of strange coming together of a book about food which couldn't be more earthly and grounding and grounded, and the fact that I've done all my talking about it through this kind of mysterious new technology that seems to have taken over our lives. And I'll talk more about that in this talk as well. So Sitopia, some of you know what this means, but for those of you who don't, it's a word I invented probably about 15 years ago now. And it just means food place. So it's a way of describing the world as it's shaped by food. And I did this, well, I'll explain later in the talk. Got to stop saying I'll explain later or I'll never get the talk done. Because I guess I had a revelation, you know, maybe 20 years ago, that we live in a world shaped by food. And it's one of those things, once you see it, that you wonder how you could possibly have not seen it before. And probably my favorite image for describing the food-shaped world that we live in is this one. Again, probably very familiar to many architects, possibly not so to everyone in the audience, but I mean, it's this wonderful image which basically sits on one wall of the town hall in Siena. And I remember visiting this when I was an architecture student, and thinking it was a beautiful image of Siena and, you know, the surrounding landscape, and not really understanding what this was really saying. Of course, if you read the title, that's quite interesting. The allegory of the effects of good government. Okay, what are the effects of good government? Well, we see a very prosperous city, but we also see, given equal billing, very unusually, a very prosperous landscape. And actually, if you look closely, you realise it's quite an artificial landscape. It's been modified, and it's been modified to feed the city, actually. And then you realise that this red wall is actually not a wall at all. It's a membrane through which stuff, people, animals, and of course food are passing the whole time. So you see asses with grain on their backs, or a pig walking to market. You see huntsmen leaving the city to maybe go and shoot a boar for dinner. Lots of work going on in the countryside, and inside the city, a flock of sheep, a woman with a basket of eggs on her head, and so on. So you realise that actually there's a kind of conversation, a constant dialogue going on, and it's a symbiosis that we're looking at here. And the effects of good government are clearly to orchestrate this. They are to make sure that this relationship remains in balance. And as I say, once you see what this picture is really about, you then think to yourself, well, why wasn't that immediately obvious? And the best answer I can come up with for that question is that food shapes our lives in so many ways, our world, our bodies, our economy, our politics, and so on, and of course our cities and landscapes, that it's too big to see. Indeed, that's why you know, seeing the world through the lens of food is so extraordinary. Why don't we see it? Well, you know, of course, one of the reasons is that these days, you know, we don't live in places where you can just kind of look out of the window and see the landscape that feeds you. It's often thousands of miles away. It's not necessarily the kind of thing you'd necessarily want to paint and stick on your wall either. So this kind of relationship between the city and the countryside, which is so fundamental to urban civilization, again, is one that we don't perceive very easily, and we certainly don't see it in balance. And I call this the urban paradox. And the urban paradox really is the fact that we talk about ourselves as living in cities, we think of ourselves as living in cities. You know, you can literally open a paper right now and it'll say something like, oh, by 2050, you know, 70% of the global population are going to be living in cities. Well, that's fine, but actually, you know, what is it? What does it mean to dwell? Because if I live in London, but all my food comes from Brazil, then where really am I living? And the paradox is that there's no real sort of ideal answer to this question. Now, of course, most people living in a city like London would have thought, oh, well, we've solved the problem of how to eat because, you know, the supermarkets were full of delicious looking food. And I think that's why COVID actually was such a shock to so many people, because it brought home that this illusion of plenty that we've created in the modern world is actually just that. It is an illusion, and it's only very, very paper thin. And underneath are all these enormous questions that obviously people like me spend our lives thinking about, but for most people is not necessarily visible. So I think it was a very, very interesting wake-up call, this moment when, you know, you could walk down a supermarket aisle and literally see a young man wrestling a granny to the ground for the last can of tomatoes, sort of thing. Very, very unedifying scenes. And of course, that brings home the relationship between food and politics that I'll talk a lot more about later. So the thing is, here is this question, the question of how to eat. Now, you know, I could just as easily put in here the question how to live, because these two questions are so closely aligned. And I think this is why, you know, as an architect looking through the lens of food, or a food person looking through the lens of architecture, you arrive at a place where you realise that, you know, everything that we've really done as a species has evolved around this shared problem of how to eat. And this has had profound implications on the way we live as well. It all really comes back to this. It comes back to this discovery, you know, somewhere between 1.5 and 1.8 million years ago, it is thought, of the ability to control fire. And of course, the ability to control fire meant that our ancestors were able to start modifying the landscape. You know, for example, to control animals and therefore hunt more easily. But also it meant that, you know, there was this other possibility of starting to cook food, which was revolutionary because it meant we could take calories on board much more quickly, which meant our brains grew bigger. And very significantly, it also meant that our ancestors were able to start specializing. So, I often say you hunt, I cook is the oldest social contract in human society, because basically the women in the camp would stay around, they'd hunt for tubers and cook them. The men could then go off and hunt. And it didn't really matter whether they were successful or not, because it was a backup meal for them to eat. This enabled our ancestors to specialize in hunting, and of course meat's a very high value food. Our brains got even bigger. And then there's the question of how do you share the food at the end of the day? And as it turns out, the shared meal evolves as this kind of language, of course, becomes part of this as well, is necessary in order to do this. Becomes the sort of the means of sharing what have in fact been, the actions of everyone in the band during the course of the day. And I believe, very strongly actually, that the shared meal is not only the first human economy ever invented, but by far the best, the most flexible, the most visible, and the most intuitively well understood. So a lot of it comes from here. And of course, as I say, the way that our ancestors lived has also shaped the way they lived. So I've kind of somewhat jokingly called this life in the larder. But I mean, for most of human history, that's exactly what we did. We lived in a place that was bounteous enough that it could feed us. We picked fruit off the trees, not necessarily always with as many momentous consequences in this case. We hunted animals, and then we moved around following the food, basically. So most hunter-gatherers have a kind of peripatetic existence of some kind, effectively following the food. But it's very, very interesting that in many creation myths, this way of life is presented indeed as paradise, because actually, in many ways, it's a kind of ideal way of life. The question of, if you like, how to eat and how to live in the hunter-gatherer world is really synonymous. And again, of course, it's no accident that when farming does come along, it's often presented not just in the Bible as a punishment, because actually farming in the early days was really, really hard work. And in fact, life expectancies dropped, people's teeth fell out, they were malnourished, a whole load of nutritional deficiency diseases kicked in at this point. But of course, there were also benefits. And one of the benefits was the creation of a food, namely grain, which really was a game changer, because grain is a food that can be, I mean, obviously you have to stay in one place, so you have to camp by the field where you're planting the seed, and protect it from animals and water it and so on. But when you've harvested it, it can be very easily stored, and it can last the whole year round. And this enables, for the first time, large non-food producing communities to evolve. And they start to begin with, and by the way, not just in the ancient Near East, but this is the trajectory I'm following, but also in Indus Valley and then in Central America as well. But of course, this was the result actually of the last major climate crisis the world faced, which was the end of the last ice age, when the large, rich forests that used to sort of exist in these zones were pushing northwards. There was a big population explosion, and people were forced to get inventive about how they fed themselves. So actually farming came as a result of the crisis, effectively, which is interesting. But then, as I say, it had this kind of payoff. And the ultimate payoff was these extraordinarily complex and interesting statted communities that just get richer and richer. And eventually there's a group down here in ancient Mesopotamia, which means two rivers, between two rivers, which are complex enough that all archaeologists agree that they deserve to be called cities. And here is one of them. This is actually a survey done by Leonard Woolley, who started surveying the city of in the 1920s. But this is really, it's basically I call it City 1.0. It's like the first urban blueprint that we have. And it's really interesting in many ways. So to begin with, it's obviously a city-state. This means it's a sort of large blob of urbanity surrounded by farmland. It's on a river, as we've already seen. It's extremely dense. So that's an example of the residential area. So very, very dense, lots of houses very close together. It's small, so that's about half a kilometre across. It's very artificial, you could say, because of course the water, I mean, it's surrounded by very, very high walls, and indeed the water itself was captured and spread over the land in order to irrigate it with thousands and thousands of miles of thousands and thousands of meters, sorry, but many, lots and lots of tunnels built by slave labor. So we get complex hierarchies evolving as well. And indeed, last but not least, this temple, which was not only the spiritual center of the city, but also its administrative center. And of course, the most important job of the temple was to organize the harvest, and also sort of, around a series of spiritual festivals that mirrored the agricultural seasons, was the practical question of how to get the food in, specifically the grain, offer it to the gods, get it safely in the temple granary, bake it in the temple bakery, and then redistribute it through the city in the course of the year. And I mean, I'm obviously simplifying something that's hugely complex, but suffice it to say that writing, accounting, money are among some of the things that were invented in order to deal with this hugely complex new way of feeding yourself. What I found really interesting is that when we look at the first sort of great piece of literature known, actually, the Epic of Gilgamesh from Uruk, another of those cities I pointed out to you, is that the if you like, the urban paradox, what I call the urban paradox, is already extremely evident. I mean, to summarize very, very briefly, Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, is behaving really badly. He's treating his slaves really badly, and the gods reckon that he needs a kind of a natural equal, who is called Enkidu, who is made in his image and is sort of brought to the city to challenge him. So nature and culture, or the countryside and the city, if you like, are deliberately brought together in a kind of in the confrontation. And again, I can't go into detail, but just the idea that the city exists in relationship with the countryside, and it's a problematic relationship. This is actually Gilgamesh and Enkidu slaying Humbaba, who is the god of the forest. And of course, this is a big ecological catastrophe that in fact brings a death to Enkidu, and so on and so on. So shall I say, the inhabitants of the early city were not unaware of the price they were paying for this kind of more complex, more elevated, if you like, form of life. I'm not sure I would use the word elevated, actually, but anyway, more complex for sure. Anyway, so, but it's very interesting as well that, you know, sort of, as I say, this urban city-state blueprint was extremely successful. It gets repeated all over the ancient world. Of course, Athens was also a city-state. And it's interesting if we sort of, you know, tune in to Plato and Aristotle worrying about what an ideal society looks like. One of the key themes, recurring themes, is, you know, how does the city feed itself? Which is obviously a big question, one that we have forgotten how to ask. And I find it very interesting that I love using, this is Aristotle we're looking at, by the way. He has this wonderful term, political animals, which he describes humans as being. And I think it really sort of summarizes the problem, in a sense, which is that, you know, we are political, which means that we need to live in society, which is why we build cities and live in them. And that's the agora you're looking at on the left. But on the same time, we're animals, which means we need nature. So there's an inherent duality that we have to resolve. And for Aristotle, the way to do this was to practice what he calls oikonomia at the bottom, which basically means household management. It's from the Greek oikos for house and nemein to manage. And both he and Plato actually reckoned that the ideal scenario for a city was that every citizen would have a house in the city and a farm in the countryside, and the farm would feed the house. This is obviously oikonomia, ideal household management. And of course, if that is repeated all over the city, then the city itself is self-sufficient. And this is ideal because then the city can also be politically independent. So the question of an ideal size of a city occurs effectively. And the answer to the ideal size of a city is that it should be big enough so that it not so big that it can't feed itself, but big enough that all the necessary functions of the city can be performed. And, you know, well, basically they argue over how big that is, but for Aristotle, it's 30,000 citizens, which I have to say probably have to multiply by 7 to include the slaves. But that's, as I say, another conversation that we can perhaps have in the questions. I mean, I put this slide in about 10 minutes before we all met up, because it's just, I mean, I want to talk a bit more about the agora, because it really is fundamental to what I think, the business of thinking about the question of what a good life is and how we should dwell through, if you like, the dual lens of architecture and food, which I suppose is what I really do, really sort of comes to fruition in a sense in the Agora, because it's like, in a way, the ultimate public space. It's bucolic, but it's in the city. It's ceremonial, it has sacred spaces, but it's also somewhere for people to gather. And it was a very inclusive space, actually. Men and women went there, even though women generally were sort of hidden from view in the space of Ideon. But also, of course, it evolves over time into a fully democratic space. So you can wander past Socrates mouthing off by the fish stalls and so on. And of course, it's a food, sorry, I haven't stated the obvious, it's the food market. So it's kind of, its whole landscape is kind of organized by food, but it also evolves into a law court. So the stowers around the side become places where trials are held, and they're open public lounges. But then at a certain point during the democratic of evolution, the democratic city, it's also where the citizens gather to vote. So you have everything, really. You have, everyday life, food, couldn't be more everyday than that. Socializing, discussing, debating, right up, if you like, to the kind of the high questions of politics, and ultimately, of course, the Acropolis is looking over. There's a lot more to say about it, but it's an interesting counterpoint to what goes for public space now, which I'll come on to later. Now, as I say, it was a very successful model, the kind of the city-state model, and it gets repeated endlessly. Pretty much until Rome comes along. Now, again, I could easily spend an hour talking about Rome and the way it fed itself. It's completely fascinating. But just to state the obvious, this is not a tiny blob of dense urbanity. In fact, Rome had an estimated 1 million citizens by the 1st century AD, which is why I've put city 2.0 at the bottom. So the question obviously arises, how would a city of this size fed itself? And I normally have a quiz at this point, but I don't know the team's medium well enough to risk that. So I'm just going to ask you to ask yourselves how you think a city like Rome might have fed itself. And then I'll give you the answer. Have a drink of water while you're thinking. Okay, here's the answer. It's food miles. So, of course, I've already talked about food miles, the fact that in the modern world our food comes from a long way away, but it's actually not a modern phenomenon. Rome was able to do this because it had access to the sea. And of course, if you're asking a question of how to feed a city, there are two key questions you're asking. One is, how do I grow the food? And grain, if you like, was the answer to that effectively. But also there's a question of transport. And in the pre-industrial world, it was about 50 times cheaper to transport food over water than over land. And this is why Rome was able to do what it did. Also, of course, with massive slave labor, military backup and all the rest of it. But it sequentially conquered Sicily, Sardinia, Carthage, and ultimately, and very famously, Egypt, exporting 6,000 farmers with, as I say, an enormous military backup. And then it just extracts its food in the form of taxes. And of course, it's not just grain, it's also pork, it's wine, it's oil, even fresh oysters from Britannia at a certain point. So Rome really, it's fascinating because it's the first city to really fully outgrow its local hinterland. And, indeed, Marshall, for example, used to say, well, Rome used to feed itself and import roses from Egypt, and now all we grow is roses and all the bread comes from Egypt. And it was seen as a sign of moral decay. But what I find really interesting about this is that, the defeat of Carthage is obviously critical, because basically you can't have two megacities competing for resources. Rome needed to dominate this enormous area to feed itself. And, it was a big drive behind the constant expansion of the empire, which, of course, eventually collapsed. And I think it is fair to say that Rome ate itself to death. The soils were certainly very depleted in North Africa by the end. And of course, it wouldn't be the first civilization that did that, nor the last. Now, the whole question of food and politics, this is the bit of the lecture I know I don't have time for, so I'm going to go really, really quickly. But this is also a very, very nice demonstration of the relationship between geography and politics and food and economy, and really the way the whole question of how society is going to be organized evolves. So here you have a very nice comparison of the main quay of London in the sort of turn of the 19th century, and similar, the main quay in Paris. And again, normally I have a quiz now and sort of say, what's the main difference you can spot? So have another drink of water while you have a think about that. And then the answer, of course, is that in London you have sailing ships, ocean-going vessels, and in Paris you have river barges. And this is critical because it means that basically London was always able to import its food from abroad easily. So in fact, you know, the Vistula, which was the kind of the main transport system for grain coming from the Ukraine, which is slightly out of shot, London was already importing a lot of its grain from the Baltic already in the 9th century. It's part of the Hanseatic League. It's just merrily trading away. Paris can't do that because Paris is 170 kilometers of slightly sluggish, clogged up river from the sea. So instead it has to go the totally opposite direction. It imposes its will on the countryside. And if you want to know more about this, I can highly recommend Stephen Kaplan's Provisioning Paris, which is longer than The Lord of the Rings, but arguably more interesting. Because basically what happens is a huge hierarchy of police called the Grain Police is set up, headed up by the king, who is known as the Baker of Last Resort. That's Louis XVI. And there's this attempt to, if you would like, take back control of the grain. So that's the grain port that I just showed you. It's right by the Hôtel de Ville. This is also non-accidental. You always find the town hall by the main market. It's because, you know, basically the food supply was clearly the most important thing in the city. Similarly, all the food trades were concentrated at Les Halles, which is close to the Louvre, again, non-accidentally. And basically the idea was, you know, that the grain police would control the supply of food. Of course, this didn't work at all. Something like a third of the food coming to Paris came in through the black market. And of course, critically, when the harvest failed, which was once every 3 years on average, the city couldn't easily import food from abroad. And when the king tried to import sort of, you know, rye instead of wheat or something, he was accused of trying to poison the people. We all know how this ended up. Series of terrible harvests in the 1780s. The king tries to flee the city and is portrayed as in this political cartoon of the time of being too greedy even to save his own skin, because he stops for a roast chicken dinner, tells the police who are catching up with him to F off, and that cartoon is called Fat Birds Fly Slowly. And if you want a sort of microcosm of why politicians hate being in charge of the food supply, look no further. Now, in contrast, London is basically, as I say, merrily getting on with it. The kings and queens of England never took responsibility for feeding London. In fact, they're downriver. In fact, they'd come begging to the city for money is basically how that works. But what's interesting is you can see that how, if we saw with Rome how the flow of food, the city's appetite could affect lands many, many hundreds of miles away, we can also see with every city actually founded before the railways, how food itself is flowing through the city and shaping the city. So grain is obviously coming in by river to the main river ports of Queenhithe and Billingsgate. It's trying to get up to Cornhill where it's traded. You can tell by the name. Bread Street is obviously where it's being sold on the way up. Fish is also obviously coming in by river. Billingsgate famously remained London's main fish market until the 1980s. Meat is walking in, and the animals are providing their own transport. And they come to they're mostly coming from places like Yorkshire and Wales and Scotland, where there's all the good grasses, and they're gathering in a smooth field outside the city, which of course becomes Smithfield, which indeed remains London's meat market until today, although very, very tragically and misguidedly, in my view, it's about to close. So essentially you can do this with any pre-industrial city, as I say. Just look at it and you'll find street names that have got food in them, and you can work out how the food was actually physically travelling through the city. At the bottom I've put Nobody Does It, because there's a brilliant book called The Food of London written by George Dodd in 1856, which is actually the only other book I've ever found which really asks the question of how you feed a city. And he basically says it's useless to ask by what authority enough food for 2.5 million citizens arrives in London on a daily basis. Nobody does it. And, you know, if you wanted a better expression of the free trade approach to feeding a city, look no further. Now, of course, if the food's flowing through the city in that way, it creates chaos, or shall we say necessary chaos. And I think this is another thing that I'm very interested in relation to food in general, is its necessariness. And I'm going to talk a lot about that later in my remaining 25 minutes, eek. But you can tell that basically living in the pre-industrial city, it was impossible not to know where your food came from because it was in front of your face, moving and bleating. Of course, if the animals are walking into the city, they then have to be slaughtered in the city. So there's 184 unlicensed slaughterhouses around Smithfield. The unwanted bits just get dumped in the Fleet River, which is just behind that row of houses. And of course, that's not very nice, and so on. It's a huge issue. But it's very, very organic and it's very visible. And what's also interesting, if we look at, this is just a map of that space, the Ogleby map, in fact, the Great Ogleby map. I've just put a yellow ring around every street that's got an animal in it. So we've got Cow Cross, we've got Chick Lane, Cow Lane, Cock Lane, and Duck Lane. So we're really looking at a city that's just kind of completely full of brute, about to be edible life. And down here at Pie Corner, so named obviously after this very, very famous pie shops, we had, really, again, the essence of where, food's capacity to bring people together, and the sort of the question of, how society, as Eric said in his introduction, the question of how society evolves really becomes extremely palpable. So most people in the pre-industrial city didn't have their own kitchens. So they would gather in taverns like this. All those enormous red things are actually ovens. You could hire out a room and you meet your friends there. And very much, I think, out of that comes this sense of the public realm. Of course, Jürgen Habermas famously talks about the evolution of the public sphere as having come directly out of the coffee houses, because actually in a coffee house, you really could sit down with a dish of coffee and talk to anyone. So in a way, I like to think the meeting we're having now is a kind of weird, sort of deracinated version of that, but nevertheless, the sociability and the commonality remain. Now, I mean, obviously, there's a ton of other stuff one can say about the co-evolution of food and cities, but this is a very, very pivotal key moment. The railways come. This image is just 1 year after that image of Smithfield I just showed you, and of course you can see cows are hitching a ride. This is the moment when, for the first time in history, it's going to be possible to transport food over great distances rapidly. Which is why I call this goodbye geography. And three key things really change at this point. The first is that food, having been very visible in the city, now becomes invisible. The second is that politicians, who to a greater or larger extent have been responsible for feeding people, so even though the kings and queens of London didn't feed London, the authorities nevertheless kept a very, very beady eye on the markets. They start to cede power over to the food companies. And last but not least, cities themselves, of course, which previously have been constrained by geography because they can't grow beyond a certain size, really can. So we see the immediate effects of that. This is London, barely bigger than the medieval city in 1840, and then very rapidly expanding into a sort of sprawling metropolis that you couldn't possibly feed from one or two open markets in the middle. And of course, at the same time, the railways are opening up previously inaccessible landscapes, very, very crucially, the American Midwest, the Great West, inhabited previously by an estimated 60 million bison and many Native American tribes who are summarily either slaughtered or moved off to reservations. Not much is done with the meat because what they really want to do is this. They want to create the biggest grain monoculture ever seen. And of course, it's the first time ever there's been more grain than people could eat. So what do you do when you've got more grain than you can eat? You feed it to animals. It's the beginning of cheap meat, the industrial meat complexes that still exist today. In many ways, the meat processors of Chicago were the great inventors of the modern food industry. They have the economies of scale, they have the ruthless business practices, they have the everything but the squeak philosophy of using every part of the animal. And crucially, they evolve logistics. So they actually control what's called vertical integration. They have which, by the way, bakers and millers in Paris were not allowed to have explicitly because they, the king saw the danger, shall we say. vertical control of the food, so everything from the production to the delivery. Of course, there's immediate payback, in this case in the form of the famous Dust Bowl, which is when all the topsoil blows away, because basically you can't go from perennial grassland to you know, annual monocropping without consequences. This is what happens to the soil. And it's really the beginning of a debate that rages today, and I don't have time to go into it today, but it's about using chemicals to beat nature into submission as opposed to nurturing the living soil. Actually, the organic guys, including Albert Howe, the father of the modern organic movement, were kind of winning that argument, but then this happened. And of course, you know, during a war, basically, it's about producing the stuff as quickly and as big quantities as possible. It's short-termism in a way, and it went totally down the chemical road with, again, consequences that we are facing right now. After the war, I mean, the next big evolution, obviously, is the car, the creation of these kinds of landscapes that you would really struggle to even to call a city. You know, nobody in their right minds walks in a landscape like that. And of course, that's over prime farmland because it's all surrounding city centres that would have been founded in the best places to feed the city. And again, you know, food logistics allow food to be delivered to these boxes outside the city, where air conditioning means you can just wander around all day in a sort of stupefied consuming days. And then you come back with your food at the end of the day and wonder what half of it is, because it's sold itself to you directly because the human has been taken out of the interaction. And this really is the kind of the beginning of our modern relationship with food, which is we don't know where it's from, we don't know what it is, we don't really get that much pleasure out of it either. And of course, if you like, this is the kind of the consummation of it. I'm not even going to drive to the supermarket anymore because some kind of slave with a peppermint green box on its back is going to just deliver me a Thai curry at 2 in the morning. What I find really interesting about this is it, in a way, is the consummation of the ancient peasant's dream. So, you know, that ancient question of how should we eat? You know, one kind of the easy, the kind of tick the box answer has always been, oh, let's just live in a world that's made of edible stuff, you know, so gingerbread houses and rivers flowing with wine and pigs wandering around with knives in their back, and we can just eat and eat and eat, and we don't have to work for it anymore. So we've kind of achieved that in a really weird way. It's just that, you know, clearly it's not doing us or the planet a lot of good. And, you know, I mean, it's very important to say that the drive of industrial food production has largely been to do with the production of this thing that doesn't exist, which is cheap food. Cheap food, I mean, if you think about what food actually is, it's living things that we either nurture or we just hunt and then kill so we can live. So food is life. So if you try to treat food as though it's cheap, you're basically treating life as though it's cheap, which is, of course, precisely what we've been doing. So we have all of these disastrous externalities, soil erosion, climate change, the use to extinction of fresh water, you know, a historical first, which is you can be undernourished and, you know, overweight at the same time. Of course, COVID is what we're currently dealing with, zoonotic disease. It's to do with loss of biodiversity and encroachment on nature. The fact that we waste up to 50% of the food we produce because, of course, we don't value it. So why would you bother not to waste it? About a third of the grain harvest is currently fed to animals, which, of course, could feed 10 times as many of us if we just ate it directly. We're spending about 10 calories of energy for every calorie we consume, and there's catastrophic decline in insect and bird life particularly, but also all kinds of life. So we're entering a 6th mass extinction. So this is just my there is no such thing as cheap food sort of explanatory sheet, I guess. And of course, if we needed further demonstration of this, as I say, COVID's been a great teacher and shiner of light, if you like, on issues that were already there. So going back to my urban paradox, for example, you know, in India at lockdown, there were 50 million or so people who were working in the city, but whose real home was in the countryside. And of course, there was this very tragic exodus when hundreds of people died because the government did very little to help them get back. So that's imbalance. Of course, there's the imbalance of nature that we've already talked about. There's social inequality. So this is basically Deliveroo type drivers in Bangkok in Thailand, kind of waiting to pick up food to deliver to people who can afford to stay at home. And of course, those of us in the UK will remember the famous oops, we're 93,000 Romanians short of a harvest moment at the start of lockdown, because we don't value food enough to even put it out of the ground in our own country. So these are all examples of kind of where we've got to. It's extremely fragile. And I'm sorry to give you more bad news, but basically the world is going this way. It's going to a place where basically the problem of how to eat, rather than being seen as a problem, shall we say a nice problem, a problem that can give joy, that can give meaning, is just seen as a technological problem to be solved. And of course, all the profit to be made in feeding people comes in this kind of highly processed lowest common denominator form, which evolved in America. And of course, the food companies now have much more power than national government. So we've kind of lost control of food effectively. Now, that is what I call my Armageddon slide. It gets a bit more cheerful after that. You'll be happy to know. I think the question we really have to ask ourselves is, you know, if technology is the answer, what was the question? And this goes back a long way. In fact, you know, the question hasn't changed. The question of how to eat, how to live, the question of, you know, how do you feed a city? What does a good society look like? It's been pretty constant. And what I find really interesting as well is if you look at, you know, various iterations of attempts to answer this question, a pattern develops. You know, so Thomas More's Utopia in a way is echoing, I mean, not all aspects of Plato's Republic, I hasten to add, but the part of it that deals with the city and the fact that small is beautiful is echoed by Thomas More, who imagines London being replaced by a series of effectively self-sufficient city-states. And Ebenezer Howe's Garden City, which I'm sure many of you know, is effectively Thomas More with railways. And it's very telling, I think, that Howard calls the Garden City a town country magnet. He's literally trying to find a way of squaring that dilemma of the fact that as political animals, we need civilization, we need society, but we also need the natural world. And effectively, it's a sort of back to the city-state idea. And that was actually when I invented this word Sitopia. It was about 15 years ago, as I say, and I wasn't having a drink of water. We're going to have one now. I was researching utopia, and I read that it's a kind of a joke word, if you like, because it can either mean a good place or no place. And I remember finding that really depressing, because I thought, we desperately need a way of looking, you know, in a very multi-dimensional way at the problem of how we should live and what a good life is and what a good society is. But our greatest tradition of that can't exist because it aims for the ideal. It was at that moment when I thought, well, utopians bang on endlessly about food, but they just don't put it here. You know, they talk about the size of the city or sharing meals or who does the work and everything. But really at the core is this question of, how are we going to share the burden of our, you know, our greatest practical problem, which is how to eat? And so hence the word. And it's a kind of practical food-based alternative to utopia, basically. So its central question is also, what is a good life? Now, if you look, I mean, this is kind of brief summary. If you look at kind of where we've been and where sort of we appear to be heading, it's quite telling. So, you know, we've gone from the technologies we've sort of, as it were, had in order to feed ourselves, gone from control of fire to farming, to the internal combustion engine and fossil fuels, and now to things like gene editing and that's lab meat. I'm sure you can recognize the most expensive hamburger in history. But of course, as it were, hanging off those advances, we have a movement from living in the larder to living in a sort of productive landscape that's heavily modified, i.e. farm, to living in cities, although where's the food coming from? And then, of course, all of these weird and wonderful visions of how we're going to feed cities in future, which I have very, very strong feelings about. And then we've also gone from this world where actually kind of living and working were kind of part of the same thing, to the extent that actually I don't know of a hunter-gatherer society that has a word for work. because it's just kind of what you do. It's just living. To this world, which, as I say, was initially seen as a punishment and immediately became very undervalued, because in the hierarchical world of the city, the people who didn't produce the food were the ones who had the power, which is a structure we still have today. And then, because that was seen as a punishment, this was seen as progress. Everyone obviously wants to sit at a desk all day staring at a screen rather than make cheese. But of course, oops, that's not going too well either, because we're all getting replaced by robots. And, you know, the question of where it all ends up, to me, really feels like this. I think this is where our prevailing vision of a good life is leading. Where, I mean, this is from the wonderful film Wall-E, by the way, if you don't know it, where humans have basically trashed the planet and they're all floating around in space. By the way, this is Elon Musk's vision as well, which I find really odd, but telling. So, well, they're two-factor walk, they're just constantly entertained, so they're not really thinking about anything. They're sucking on some food-related substance. And this is a very worried robot who's come up from Earth to try and save them. So it's a kind of really weird place where we're heading for. We've forgotten, it would seem, that when you ask the question of what is a good life, you know, there are choices. You can either make everything as efficient as possible. That's the so-called CAFO, or concentrated animal feeding operation, which is thousands of cows being fed grain pumped full of antibiotics and wandering around in their own poo. Or, oh, hello, we actually co-evolved with cattle because they can eat grass and we can't. And you can actually create a beautiful sort of natural synergy by letting them do that. Yes, you can't eat as much meat, but it's much higher quality. In fact, well, I won't go into this, but grass-fed beef is a superfood and grain-fed beef is not, in shorthand. Food used to bring us into the city. It was, as I said at the beginning, it's really what has always primarily animated public space. But oh no, let's leave the city in the name of efficiency, or just indeed dial it up on our phones. And then this extraordinary thing of, you know, the fact that eating a meal around a table with other people is kind of how we evolved as a species. And yet my favorite pre-lockdown stat from America was that, you know, 1 in 5 meals was being eaten in a car, because everyone's too busy to eat, obviously, because they're off doing something more important. So the question is, which of these decisions actually creates a good life? Now, you may have seen sort of hidden within that there are competing paradigms. And I find it very interesting that, you know, in our very sort of technologically enabled world, as it were, they're evolving into camps. You know, on the one hand, you've got the life hack. And this is a gorgeous looking college student slugging down Soylent, which some of you may have heard of as this kind of a food replacement sludge pioneered in America. Or, you know, is a good life a sort of return to actually working with our hands? And by the way, hands are really important in the evolution of intelligence, because that's how we evolve, through making stuff and working with our hands and using tools. And of course, these competing paradigms stem out of competing philosophies. So on the one hand, this is the inventor of Soylent, Rob Reinhardt. He was a wireless mast inventor until he realized that he was a bright guy eating rubbish food and thought he could do better. He's completely fascinating, actually, but I love this quote from him. Worrying about something as simple as food in the digital age is weird. Okay, so we can just tech our way out of everything, basically. I've contrasted him with Epicurus. He doesn't actually say, well, he said a lot, but most of his stuff's been destroyed, so he's not quite as kind of easy to quote from. But the quote I've picked is one saying self-sufficiency is freedom, which is basically the idea that, you know, do it yourself, do it with your hands, and, you know, you kind of engage with necessity, as it were, this idea of necessity again. And of course, Epicurus is probably one of the most misrepresented people on the planet, because Epicureanism now reads as kind of gourmetism, but actually he's the total reverse. He actually says if you go to the things in life that give us direct pleasure, like eating, satisfying hunger, it's the greatest pleasure you're ever going to have. So it's a kind of very ascetic hedonism. Anyway, of course, you know, there are no silver bullets. So surprise, surprise, Soylent, which started out as the end of food, we're never going to need food again, now comes in different flavors, because it turns out we actually quite like a bit of diversity and interest in our lives. And of course, it's not just about what we eat, it's actually about absolutely everything else. So just for an example, that's what a piece of cheese looked like in Britain in 1970, and I was there and I remember it. And this is what a British cheese shop looks like today, an artisanal cheese shop, that is. We've actually got more artisanal cheeses in the country now than France does, which is mind-boggling. But of course, you know, if you treat the need to eat as a wonderful necessity out of which you can get joy, then you kind of turn everything on its head. Yeah, that costs more than that. But then what is value? I stuck this in about 5 minutes before we started speaking, because it just occurred to me that, you know, part of the problem that we're facing at the moment in this unbelievable crisis of, you know, the vision of what a good life is in the West, you know, and I write about this extensively in the book as well, about how in America there's this really weird combination of an ideology which is about a good life being actually originally on the land. I mean, Lockeanism, you know, the idea that everyone should have their farm and be able to farm it, but then money replaces land, and of course land represents food, so land is real, money is not real, and of course now the whole thing is totally imploding. But it is to do with deracination, and I'm fairly sure that if, you know, you dial back to 1950 when something like 60% of Americans were farmers, I don't think this would have happened. You know, I think, you know, the conflict I spoke about at the beginning about food being something that grounds us in a place and is real and is physical and you can actually make yourself. It's a necessary counterpart to this bizarre world that we've got now where nobody actually meets in an agora anymore. They just go online and listen to the latest stuff that some weird orange nutter is spouting. So I guess, you know, the question of how to eat and how to live well really come together most obviously is if we look at traditional food cultures around the world, which are unbelievably diverse. I mean, we are omnivores, as Michael Pollan wrote in his famous book, Omnivore's Dilemma. You know, the sort of the dilemma of an omnivore is there's just so many ways you can do it. And we're incredibly adaptable. So, for example, you know, the Inuit live mostly off seafood, and the Maasai live mostly off cattle, you know, milk and blood. This is possible for humans. We don't really need carbs, and in fact, you know, their livers have evolved to allow them to basically sort of combine all the molecules that they gain from this very, very protein-rich diet to create the carbs they need. But of course, it's also about the landscapes we create. It's about the way we manage land that is not ours. And this is very interesting. I've got these highly decorated cows in here because this is actually an example of transhumance in Austria and Switzerland, where basically there's 1,000-year-old tradition of keeping cows in common land in the Alps and then bringing them down, and that's why the cows are dressed up, because they're coming in for the winter. You know, but these very, very ancient, extraordinary, very sophisticated ways of living in a place. And of course, the French term terroir relates to kind of which angle it's best to grow your wine on explicitly, but it's also about how to live well in a place, a specific place. And I think there's urban terroir as well, and I'm really running short of time, so I'm going to try to be very quick here. But actually, one of the things that led me in the end to write about food and cities together was, I mean, inspired by Peter Carl, actually, who's here tonight very excitingly for me, to study an area of Rome. And I chose the market area, which you can see here. Of course, the original market of Rome was the Forum, because most cities evolved around the exchange of goods, including food, which predated the cities themselves. And therefore, real kind of aficionados, that's the Temple Vestae, where the mundus, which is where the city was really founded, but also married to the earth, is there in the middle of the Forum. And then when the city grows, the markets get bigger. You've got the Forum Boarium, which is the cattle market, and the Forum Holatorium, which is the vegetable market. And of course, those are relocated by the river because that's where all the food's coming in. So it's a kind of landscape that over time evolves in a really, really interesting way. Markets once established very rarely move. And of course, Rome is the ideal place to study something like that because it's got literally thousands of years of history you can kind of still see. So that is that area as it was in at the height of the empire. That's the theatre of Marcellus. And here you can see the same theatre being the backdrop to Piazza Montanara, which was the main kind of country bumpkin, everyday market of Rome, where country people came in to have urban services like having their hair cut or their teeth pulled out, and also to sell food, obviously. And of course, this lasts into, in fact, it lasts till Mussolini gets rid of it all and turns this into a monument. But you know, it remains the market area, and it remains an area where it's inhabited by butchers in the 19th century. So I actually call this the mundane order of the city, and I did this study in the 1990s, and it's one of the key things that led me to realize how powerfully food shapes cities. I just chose the market district intuitively because I knew that would be where evidence of everyday life would be most obvious, as it were, and I guess I was right there. I mean, what I found really interesting is that people don't normally bother to register everyday stuff because it's as I say, it's too big to see. It's just what you do, and the word mundane itself expresses that, because mundane, the root of the word, we use it obviously to mean boring, everyday, you know, kind of low level, but the root of the word is mundus, which means cosmic, of the universe, worldly. And I think this is the essence of, for me, where my food related study and my architectural related study really come together, is the fact that it's all the everyday stuff that you overlook, but it has this incredible longevity over literally thousands of years. This is the stuff that matters. Of course, we've lost all of that. We've kind of gone into this crazy deracinated world. And so the question is, you know, where do we go from here? For me, this is where food is probably the most important thing, you know, way that we have of asking the questions we need to ask. It's a way of seeing the world. This is what Sitopia is, and it leads you to ask really big questions like, what is a good life? What is our relationship with nature? What is our relationship with one another? And it was when I was, shortly after I invented the word and wrote my book Hungry City that Robert kindly referred to earlier, I was trying to work out, okay, how do we do this? And this is really the birth of the book that has become Sitopia, that just came out last year. And I'm showing this embarrassingly awful drawing because it really was how I thought. And as Eric also kindly said in his introduction, I think like an architect. I can't help it. It has to be visual. It has to be spatial. It just is. That's the way the world is for me. That's even the way my own brain is to me. And so I just drew a plate of food, and then I drew a table around the plate, and then I drew people around the table, and then I just started saying things like sharing, connectedness, and so on. And then I drew a cook figure, could be a mother of children, could be a father, could be anyone, you know, other denominations are available. And I wrote love and caring and nurturing, but also coming back, you know, receiving, gratitude, and so on. Where did the food come from? It came from a market. Okay, so we have money, trust, knowledge, exchange, economy. Where does the market sit? In the city. Where does the city sit? In the countryside. Where does the countryside sit? In a thing we call nature. Where does nature sit? Well, kind of in the universe. Like I said, it's kind of really bad 10-minute long drawing. But I mean, it occurred to me that if I turn this drawing on its side, as it were, and draw a section through it, this could be a book. And this indeed is the book that Sitopia turned into. So these, again, this is the original sketch, which is why it's not very presentable, but nevertheless, this is when the thinking happened. It's basically, I went from the idea of food, which is life, through the body. So it's like expanding scales of the question of what food is, through the body, the home, society, city and country, nature and time. And actually, I only realized that this structure really had a kind of symmetricality about it halfway through. But of course, you know, food is life, but time is death, if you like. So those kind of meet round the back. The body, I mean, our problems that we're facing at the moment is that we've evolved a world that we are out of sync with. We've kind of exo-evolved, as it were. The answer is we have to get back in balance with nature again. We've stopped producing our own food. We've stopped living in a place where we feed ourselves. We live in cities and we rely on others to feed us. So we're deracinated. We have no basis in the world. And again, by rethinking the landscape, we can put that right. And of course, it hinges around society, which is essentially about sharing. And of course, the ultimate economy, as I said at the beginning, is the shared meal. So that's really the vision, the Sitopian vision, is that we rethink the world around the idea that food is life, and it's the most valuable thing in the world that we have to sort of, as it were, work to produce. And I've used these examples because they're from moments of crisis like London during the war, or Cuba after the fall of the Soviet Union, or Detroit when the cars left. But basically, these are moments when food sprang into life. It became the basis of new networks and new communities because it had to. So crisis is interesting because it shows you true value. And of course, as I say, this is what a good society looks like to me. It so happens that some people here tonight are also in this image. In fact, that's Peter, but with his back to you. But the point is that if you say that a society, a good society, is one in which everybody eats well, and you really follow that through, then everything follows from it. And it's a revolutionary idea, by the way. Of course, interestingly, COVID's not only shone a light on what's bad about our world, but also possible ways we can recover. It's shown new neighborliness, so people's rediscovery what it means to live in time and have time. Why did we evolve that economy when nobody had any time to do anything anymore? It's completely weird. Local food networks have sprung up. People have got sort of more interested in growing their own again. These are all things I was arguing for in the book before COVID, by the way. I'm going to give myself 2 more minutes and I'll be over, by the way, in case Matthew's worrying. Of course, it means working with nature. That debate's over. We've gone down the wrong path for 70 years, but luckily there are incredible examples of how we can do this. It's all about the living soil. Of course, we can incorporate food into our thinking about the city. Many examples of how to do this as well. I put Smithfield Market up here because as I said earlier, very sadly and tragically to me, it's now looking like it's going to be redeveloped into some mall or something, which I think is a huge mistake, because I think we need to rethink the city through food. And again, COVID has really thrown up the question again of what the relationship between the city and the countryside can be, because of course people discover they can work from home, which means, like Robert, they can be in the middle of Sussex and still do their job in the city. So these are huge questions that I think food is ideally placed to help us answer. And of course, we can bring the city and the country closer together in the way that we think regionally. And there are many examples of how we can do this as well. From Patrick Geddes, you know, the so-called father of regional planning 100 years ago, talking about preserving lumps of countryside so we get star-shaped cities, through to Bernard Villejeunes today saying, let's kind of bring productive tongues of land back into the city and inhabit vacant spaces, or interrogating the productive hinterland, or indeed incorporating food into new urban models. And this really brings us back to, I wanted to ask Peter a question after his last talk, and actually I wanted to say both the talks that this series already had. So David's talk, where he talked about, I think it was intrinsic externality, and when Peter, as Eric said in his introduction, also talks about sort of the embeddedness, if you like, of ethics, in the everyday livedness of the city. I think what I'm sort of groping towards, and what I feel food can give us, is this understanding of how many individual particularities, because let's face it, we all eat differently and we all have different microbiomes and all the rest of it, how they can come together in this unbelievably rich world that really, if it's allowed to flourish, makes the city very much like living soil. And that's really where I've got to. I just wanted to say that it's so wonderful to talk to this audience today. Peter and Dalibor no longer with us, very sadly, but were incredibly inspiring teachers, as was Eric, and I'm delighted to have been invited to teach with all 3 of them. This is part of the, I know many people here today are in this picture. It's a kind of ongoing, and I hope ever expanding world. As Matthew said at the beginning, it's not a club, it's a family, and families can grow. And I wouldn't be doing the work I'm doing without these people. So thank you. If you want to know more, it's all in here. Thanks a lot.
That was wonderful, Carolyn. Thank you. Matthew, you're going to start off, and I'll pitch in thereafter, right?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do it. In fact, what I'm going to do, because I think I can, is I'm going to do what I'd always like to do at this moment, which is to hand over to Nick, because Nick has a wonderful way of summing things up and setting us on a new pathway.
Right. Well, thanks, Matthew. Thank you very much, Carolyn. A brilliant, insightful, thought-provoking lecture, which is also incredibly timely and raises a multiplicity of issues. The one thing that struck me about your paper, your presentation, you said something which I thought was really interesting about the invisibility, a point at which food becomes invisible in the city. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you say that food animated or animates public space. And I think the relationship between these two issues, to me, is absolutely crucial. Mm. That there lies the interface between architecture, urban space, or our urban life, and food. And the one thing that seems to me to be critical here, you obviously talk about this issue of the mundane life of the city. But what I think is interesting is the relationship between, let's say, the chaotic nature of food in its introduction into the city, the relationship between the city and the country, the issue of transportation, but also one thing which you don't talk about, which I know is kind of underlies a lot of what you describe, is the decorum of food. Mm. And it came to mind when a number of years ago I went to a conference on the urban commons. There was a lecture given by Doina Petrescu. And it was a project that number of projects she did in London, and it was basically about vacant car parks converted into basically places for growing vegetables within the city. And when I saw a presentation, the first thing that struck me was Lorenzetti's painting, the allegory of good government, and this separation between the place in which food is grown and its transference into the city. And what happens in the city with food is it's put on display and it's consumed, and all the kind of rituals that go around food about this idea of the good life as you describe. And the one thing I'd be interested to know is where you see this issue of decorum in the contemporary world of food, in view of the fact that the impact of, supermarkets, the invisibility of food, the fact we don't know where it comes from, we just consume it, it's processed. But I think this thing about invisibility to me is the most interesting part of your presentation, because it comes to mind about all these other things as architects that we are facing in our battles, in our attempts to try and deal with, about the decline of public space and the role of architecture.
I think I'm still being an architect, by the way. I mean, because I couldn't possibly do the work I do without thinking like one. No, it's really, thank you for that question. It's really interesting. I mean, in terms of decorum, as you probably picked up, I'm not a great fan of Deliveroo. And, I have nothing against the actual principle that you can get a takeaway, but I think the way it's become the norm, that you just, lie around. I mean, the Finns have a word for it. They call it, being drunk in your underpants, but it's kind of, you're lying around, 2 in the morning, I fancy a Thai curry, and just dial up on the phone, and this kind of slave appears out of the night, with this bag. This is just wrong to me. And, you raise the issue of decorum. I mean, food to me is sacred, in the same way that life is sacred. And I think one of the things that I'm wrestling with is, this idea that, the technological journey has been about trying to solve the problem of life as if it's solvable. I mean, it's such a ridiculous thing. It's not solvable. You can't solve the fact of being a conscious human on the planet without knowing what that means, So for me, the respect for life and respect for food go together. The respect, and the respect for other people through the medium of food, which is ultimately the greatest thing that we share, because it's the most valuable thing in our lives, and I mean, as I say, it's only in a crisis when you see a young man wrestling a granny to the ground in a supermarket for the last can of tomatoes that you realize, oh, wow, civilization is wafer thin and is like the opposite of decorum. And I think, many of the problems that we have and that we face at the moment, and this is where, I think we need ritual desperately. And I mean, actually, the last chapter of Sitopia is called Time. and it's about how we need to go back to living in time. And of course, decorum is ultimately about, you know, the sort of the means and the ways and the symbols and the actions and the festivals that we evolve to remind us that we live together on a revolving planet, you know, because we have to align our lives to earthly time or we're screwed. And of course, a lot about what the kind of, you know, the modern industrial project is all about is trying to eliminate all of that. You know, it's trying to get rid of all the stuff, get all the walls away, get all the boundaries away. Yeah, I can just be a consumer 24/7. Well, again, you know, that's something that I really believe is leading us to destruction. So I'm really about saying, I guess one of the things I am saying is that food is just such an obvious way that we can put that orderliness back, you know, by respecting food, by respecting the people who feed us, by respecting the people we share with, which is, by the way, are humans and non-humans, because every living being on earth eats. We can get that sort of sense of decorum back, and it's worldly decorum, you know. And of course, historically, through history, that's what everything from table manners to kind of dressing correctly, and even the design of buildings has had in its mind, is how do we create the order, you know, from the chaos that allows us to sort of, you know, to share, but also to sort of express the fact that, you know, we have this relationship with a planet, ultimately, with the cosmos. So I think food is just, it's just ideally placed, in fact, to not only to ask those questions theoretically, but actually do it. Yeah. You know, use a tablecloth, sit down nicely, you know, kind of cook for your friends and make it nice. Show your love through food.
Thank you very much.
I think it's it would be, you know, very valuable time to come at this from as many points as we can, Carolyn. So let's move to Matthew, and I'll move through and call up all the hands that are coming up.
Matthew, you need to unmute.
Matthew, you need to
unmute.
unmute. Yeah. Thanks.
There we go. I've unmuted myself. So yes, I was just saying that this maybe is can be just maybe part of a string of questions from other people as well, but also just a response partly to what Nick has said. I think that there's something which many of us are feeling here, because it's nice to see you again, Carolyn, but also something about the way that you've been talking about these issues, which moves so much from philosophy to what's on your fork and back again. And I think it's this aspect of kind of deliciousness and the kind of pleasure and fun of eating, which is exactly this aspect of the Epicurean that you're talking about. And I was telling you earlier that I got your book for my birthday from James, I think, who is here, and Christopher. And I've been reading. I started reading it, and then I've started reading it more earnestly again over the weekend. And one of the passages that really stood out to me is when you start to talk about taste, and how taste is really very much like interpretation in the way that we think about and talk about architecture and the city, but also it is this dimension of pleasure, it's defense, it's got all of this data in it, but then it's the other things as well, discernment. It brings to you the character of that situation or the issues that you're dealing with. And then there's the other aspects of taste which have to do with luxury and stimulation. And in thinking, I suppose partly in thinking through some of that, and that dimension of experience, which is discovery and enjoyment, in some ways, taste gives us this sort of deep understanding of the function of articulation in relation to some of the things that Peter was saying last time, which really does travel down to very core fundamental dimensions of our being, and at the same time dances around the kind of upper levels of what we want to say and how we want to experience the world in a sophisticated way. So it can also create this distance. And around these issues of taste and beauty and charm, I guess I was just wanting to bring the possibility of thinking about food as also bringing back a place, certainly in this discussion about architecture and the city, a place for sophistication of our thinking, which I think is one of the problems that is at the core of some of the conversations we're having in the seminar.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much for that. I mean, I am fascinated by the fact that the word taste both means kind of yum yum umami and ooh, I don't like that sofa. I mean, it's a really interesting kind of conflation, and I think they are related. And I mean, for me, you know, one of the most interesting things, I mean, reading, I mean, the food people in the audience will know the great Harold Mcgee, who is also on the Oxford Food Symposium, kind of in that family. Talked amazingly in his book on food and cooking about the way taste is like the most primal, the primal sense, because literally even a protozoa tastes, because they have to get nourishment in from the environment and they have to decide between what is nourishing and what is poison. You know, so this absolutely fundamental judgment that it involves is, of course, what it shares with the other kind of taste, as you say. And it's interesting. I mean, I think, you know, like Epicureanism has been hijacked by the wrong people. All the good ideas get hijacked by the wrong people, including democracy and freedom. But anyway, you know, the idea that Epicureanism has become this idea of, oh no, I only drink Chateauneuf de Pape sort of thing. It's just such rubbish. I mean, actually, Epicurus said, you know, you only need bread and water, basically, because the pleasure you get from satisfying hunger and satisfying thirst is as good as it gets. All the sophistication, if you like, of human enjoyment is in the necessary. And this, for me, is really, really important. So he talked about the fact that, you know, if you just drink wine every day and, you know, you have too much honey and too many sweetmeats, you will lose the ability to get that pure pleasure out of just bread and water, and that is the problem. So I think there's a kind of question of corruption buried in there. And for me, it's about, I mean, I remember when I was actually being an architect and teaching students, one of the things I would always say is go from scale to scale, you know, draw it at 1 to 20, draw it at 1 to 2000, you know, keep the thinking moving as though it's a muscle, basically. And I think it's the same when we kind of ask the question of what matters in life, what is a good life. You know, we have to sort of say, we have to remember the fundamentals. And from the you know, got to get your feet on the ground, literally. And once your feet are on the ground, and for me, actually having my fingers in soil is a really good way of doing that, growing my own food, then you can listen to an opera and it has some frame of reference. You know, it's not just woo up here. It's kind of got what, you know, both Peter and Dalibor taught many of us to think of as verticality, you know, the verticality of a culture, which also, by the way, Stephen Mennell very brilliantly wrote about in his book, All Manners of Food. He talks about a great food culture going from what the peasants are doing to what the king's doing and everything in between. You know, you need the landscape and you need the aspiration and everything as a movement. So I think that's a really, really wonderful insight as well.
Can we bring in Emma, who's Emma Davenport, to come in?
Hi, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, my camera's not working, so I just got audio, but it was really just an observation that happened on the weekend that I think really fits in with your book and, you know, seeing the world through food. But I was talking to a paramedic at Newham Hospital, and they were telling me that they are working 12-hour shifts, and as a result of their 12-hour shifts, they don't have any breaks. There was an idea to give them breaks, but then that kind of fell to the wayside. So as a result, while they're on their shift, they are calling up Deliveroo or Uber to deliver food to them while they're at somebody's house. So the person, but they'll give an address about 2 doors down so that you know, confidentiality is kept. But, you know, they were sort of laughing about how the delivery driver will knock on the door or see them. But I just thought, wow, this is such an example of how food and social infrastructure are so integral to one another. And, you know, if you have people working on a 12-hour shift, there's just no time, you know, food isn't built into that, the sharing food, the eating of food, and where you have a system that you only have 2 people working for 12 hours non-stop,
Yeah, no, I mean, I thank you. Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a brilliant example. And I think what's interesting is that, you know, you're talking about a really, really extreme situation. You're talking about someone who is saving lives literally on a kind of endless loop, and it could not be more important. And of course, they can't afford to go down to their local farmers market and all of this. But the irony is that that is how we've constructed society. Absolutely. You know, that's where industrial capitalism has led. Is so that everyone is on this treadmill. Everyone's too busy to cook, too busy to eat, too busy to think, too busy to have a life, and you know it's insanity, frankly. And I mean, one of the really, I mean, for me, as I say, the silver lining, and my God, we need them at the moment. But one of the silver linings of COVID, as I said, is the fact that so many people have discovered, wow, you know, I quite like being at home with my kids. I quite like cooking with them. I quite like having time to walk in the local park. You know, and actually see spring happening. And I often say that, you know, the things that really matter in life are the things that you wish you'd done more of when you're lying on your deathbed, you know, and the what that you want to do. It's, you know, have the people you love around you, maybe see a beautiful tree out of the window. You know, we need each other, we need humans, and we need nature. And food sits at the nexus. It's the only thing that sits absolutely at the nexus of those two things, because it joins us to each other and it joins us to the natural world. And that's why I think if we rethink a good life through the lens of food, we'll realise that living in rhythm with the planet and living in rhythm with the day, and actually just living in time as well as in place, is really important. And it makes, you know, it's
thanks.
Thank you.
Could we turn to Christian, and I'm hoping that we're going to move into the world of the informal as well as the formal, but over to you, Christian.
Yeah, I mean, what I was very interested by, a wonderful talk by Karen, thank you so much for that, is your use of the, obviously use of the word festival, which I've written quite a bit about and I'm very interested in. And for me, it's the diversity of a festival. And one of the things I've always complained about is that when you put 3 tables of food in a room, someone calls it a food festival. and for me, that this undermines the what Eric has just talked about, the formal and informality that is a part of a festival, that depth of culture that one's dealing with, that I think probably society has sort of moved towards a compartmentalization of sport as well, that then there's no longer the sort of agonistic dilemma of competition in the same way that it perhaps didn't. And so there's a sort of a forgetting of the debate of the city as much as where the food comes from. There's a sort of a much broader horizon of forgetting, if you like, that's going on within the city, which of course forms a little part of the title of the talks that we've got going on. And I think that's very interesting that you keep talking about festival, but I was very interested in one thing you didn't really talk much about, and I wondered whether you could talk a little bit more about the weather, because obviously there's a seasonal thing which works with festivals, and that food forms a part of festivals, and it's often part of the way we recognise the time of the year with the type of food that we consume with a festival, and that's very much a part. And since festivals have disappeared, we've often lost that. But I think probably as a country, and particularly growing up by the sea, weather was always a very, very important part of the way we saw food and the way we see life. And was that a part of your research at all? Did weather appear in any form?
I mean, yeah, it does appear. Thank you very much for the lovely comments and also the question. It's a fantastic question. I mean, the most interesting, yes, of course. I mean, it's a huge part of the whole food thing, and I mean, one of the most interesting conversations I had actually when I was researching Hungry City was I went to one of these enormous factories where they kind of make, you know, all the curries for Sainsbury's or whatever it was, you know, and I was talking to them about how they plan ahead, and they said, well, we need to know what the weather's going to be doing more than farmers do, because they said if it's pouring with rain on a Friday night, instead of going out, people are going to grab a curry from the supermarket on the way home. They don't want to be out in town. So, but if it's then drizzling, you know, then they'll try and cheer themselves up, and then they'll go for this other kind of food. And it was literally, they went through the sort of the weather on a particular day, and it literally is going to shift what 10 million people ate from this to this. And of course, we all know, you know, you watch the kind of the weather in your supermarket as kind of all the barbecue stuff comes out in June and all the kind of chocolate teddies come out in September for Christmas. You know, so of course, you know, in a country like the UK, weather and climate are kind of interchangeable in a sense, you know, because they're both kind of happening in a somewhat unpredictable way. But obviously, I mean, one of the things that I really think is important, so, you know, going from weather to climate, as it were, and then obviously sort of planetary time again, you know, I think, as you rightly say, historically, I mean, I wish I'd had my Bruegel in there. You know, I love the battle between Carnival and Lent, which is one of my favourite images for the marketplace, and the fact that, you know, this is an agricultural festival that's being replayed in the city, and it's basically preparing everyone for the hungry gap, you know, the agricultural hungry gap, which is what the fasting is. But then, of course, it's all going to be fine again because we're going to have Easter. I mean, that is literally a kind of an ancient ritual to do with praying to the gods to make the soil fertile again for the next year, but also keeping people happy, you know. So Carnival, the wonderful turning upside down of everything and the sort of the celebration of the flesh is also very much part of that too. So, you know, and I think, you know, in terms of weather, just that feeling of how food and a space, you know, whether it's an urban space or a space in the countryside, it ties us literally physically to the world around us, and that is such a big part of feeling at home. And I think feeling at home is such a fundamental human need, and another thing that we've forgotten about, you know. So, you know, that's how I would tie it in, to sort of say, oh, it's a bit chilly, I'm going to have an enormous pie and I'm going to be all snuggly indoors. It's very Bachelardian, you know. Or boiling hot, I'm going to go and build a fire in the middle of the wood and fry some sardines, you know. It absolutely controls us, but it also, I mean, because food goes from the outside to inside, literally, you know, and because we are made of the food that we eat, it literally ties us to, it reminds us that we are part of the continuum of the world, which on the one hand is ever changing, and on the other hand has these rhythms and so on. And I mean, that's, I think, how I would sort of say, you know, food, weather, climate, and you know, the sense of belonging somewhere all kind of ultimately tie in together.
I'd just like to try and grab two more questions as we go. So can we ask Anna Kim to pitch in, followed by Dagmar, and then we'll do a little summary because we're running over, but that it's just it's so rich. It's too easy to do. So Anna, you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. Putting food at the center of the question of what constitutes the good life is certainly a terrific provocation and project. And since you mentioned Aristotle so much, I thought I would just make a very brief observation that sort of brings together the beginning and the ending of your talk. Certainly, you know, it's interesting. I don't think the philosophers thought much about food, as you know. And, you know, when Aristotle talks about eudaimonia or human flourishing, it really has very little to do with the baser passions, as both he and Plato would agree. Eating is one of them. So hence food production vanished outside of the city where the important things take place, right? But there is an interesting way in which things have come back around, so that when Aristotle was brought in to rethink, say, world economics by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, to give a more expansive vision of what constitutes human thriving or flourishing, then Aristotle was used precisely in these larger ways to think about, for instance, food and nourishment and human development in a way that, you know, thinking elementally about what is necessary to bring out the fullest human potential, human capabilities theory, essentially. So there's an interesting way in which that Aristotelian ideal, which, you know, kind of put food to the side originally, has come back around and shapes now UN developmental goals And I think that, yeah, we are thinking more in terms of this larger, more human idea of thriving, right? That puts things like food at the center. So I just wanted to make that observation.
Yeah, no, it's really, really interesting. Thank you very much for that. I mean, I find it very, very amusing kind of reading, as it were, Plato in particular on the subject of food. I mean, he absolutely dismisses it. It's quite Dalaborean in some ways, you know, it's kind of, actually Dalibor cooked quite a bit. But, you know, yes, I mean, food was something that was grown by slaves and served by women, and generally kind of didn't sort of feature at the same level as, you know, enormous questions like what size should the city be? And I find it endlessly fascinating that they just couldn't put those two things together, which so obviously belong together. I mean, I'm a great fan of Aristotle, apart from his blindness to, as it were, the other in that sense. And, you know, because I love this idea, you know, he's the way he talks about the need for balance, which of course is also a very, very Greek ideal. And I think, you know, that the balance is there in certain parts of his thinking and not in others. And as you rightly say, I think we're now discovering that, you know, all of these things come together, and actually, you know, if you add the other into the mix, then it's an incredibly powerful way of thinking. So I could talk a lot more, but I'm not going to because we're overrunning. But thank you. It's a really, really interesting question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would just add that if an idea of Sitopia would be, I think, some medieval monks practicing their ora and labora and farming and, you know, bringing the highest spirituality with the physicality, much more than the ancient Greeks, I would say. Yeah, yes, thanks.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Anna. Could we turn to Dagmar, please?
You're muted.
You're muted, Dagmar. The disease of the system.
Is this any better?
Yes.
Hi. These are really interesting and good ideas, obviously, and one agrees with everything that you've said. And you've done such a lot to bring these ideas to, you know, to public attention through your two books and through your various media appearances and so on. Very impressive. But I do think that to implement them, there has to be political power, a kind of will behind it. And I'm just wondering how optimistic you are that that can be somehow garnered. So, for example, the banal example of the markets, the Smithfield Market, which is about to be turned into a posh shopping center. What can we do? I mean, what can one do, an average person, to try to stop these kind of transformations?
Thank you very much. It's such an important question, and it exercises me greatly. And as I think Robert mentioned in his introduction, I had the rather surreal experience of over the summer of doing a program with the food program in which I got to pretend to be the Prime Minister for a.
That's the one I heard.
Yeah, and it was amazing to actually think, okay, what would it be like? And what it ended up feeling like was William Morris's News from Nowhere with technology. You know, bizarrely, I mean, I literally could see Trafalgar Square with you know, apricot trees in it, sort of thing. So, and that's really what we try to get across. I mean, in terms of real power, it's so interesting. I mean, that's the reason why the bit of the lecture that I knew I didn't have time for, which is the whole bit about London and Paris, had to stay in, because it's just so important to me to understand why politicians are terrified of food. They are completely terrified of it, partly because they've lost control of it and it's the most important thing. So every politician pre the railways literally knew that feeding people or making sure people were fed was their most important duty, even if they were lucky enough, as it were, like the kings and queens of London, to have a kind of very, very kind of able free trade system just kind of happening downriver and not have to really bother about it. But they hated it. It was a nightmare for them. And therefore, the moment the food companies hove over the hill, they just went, thank goodness we don't have to worry about that, and ceded responsibility. So what you're talking about, if you're saying to politicians now, and of course, as we know, the only time since then that they've actually taken control of the food supply has been in war, in times of war, when they've had to, been forced to. And of course, they've done it all wrong when they've done that as well. And there's so much to say about this. I mean, it's a whole other discussion, frankly, but I mean, it's the key point. You're really right. We need to put this at the core of our politics. That's what I'm arguing for. And there are obviously different ways of doing that. On the one hand, as individuals, we can make a big difference, yes, but of course that's not going to be enough. I'm arguing in my book for the true, if you like, true cost accounting of food. What I call Sitopian economics is basically putting the true cost of the production of food into food. This is a revolutionary idea because our entire society has been built and predicated on the existence of something that doesn't actually exist, called cheap food. I mean, this is the problem. And so to say to a politician, take food seriously, is like saying, oh, by the way, all that stuff you've been peddling for the last century is rubbish. Literally, you know, because it's taking labor for, I mean, the ideal cost of production in a capitalist system is zero, as you know. So that's the way it all tends, you know, and it treats nature as though it comes for free, and it treats people as though they ideally not exist, but if they must exist, they have slave wages, and so on and so on. Turning that on its head is a global, I mean, it's a global challenge. But I think with climate change, with global extinction, you know, all this stuff, all the externalities that we've been able to ignore for decades is now catching up with us. And food, you know, if you value food and put it at the core, so many things fall into place. You know, public health, equity, finding jobs for people to do. So I think if one could package it in a way and present it to politicians, I mean, this is probably something I'm going to end up having to do somehow, you know, and say, look, you've got all of these problems that you're struggling with. If you start valuing food and putting it at the centre, you solve all of them. It involves, by the way, wealth redistribution and land reform, for example. I mean, that's how revolutionary it is. How do we get people listening? I don't know. I talk to anyone who'll listen, frankly. That's my policy. But
thank you. You know, I mean, I think having got to that fantastic sort of foundation, if you will, of where change can happen, it would be interesting, I think, to just come back. I love those sketches of yours, you know, to thinking about how the two streams of spatial thinking, architectural thinking, whether it's city thinking, you know, or can be drawn together through precedent and possibility, because I think there's an awful lot that's actually working, which is very precious, you know, from markets through to the conditions in which we dine, you know, the scales, you know, for artists, the scales at which their work is seen is incredibly important. For diners, that's really important, from the domestic, you know, through to more formal kind of conditions, all of which are there. So somehow this sort of sense in which I'm hoping, you know, as the next stage, along with your political role, you know, the spatial role of dealing with, for architects, you know, the sense in which food is presented is worked from the raw to the cooked, and in architectural terms, just the same, is something we could all enjoy at a next stage, Carolyn. And what you've given us is fantastic. So thank you so much for the meal. You know, unbelievably fulfilling, and at the same time, you know, full of elements of kind of doom that we have to protect ourselves from. So many thanks on behalf of everyone, and a very big audience. And I'm sure there are lots of other questions which need to be addressed at another time, but that's great. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure and joy. It really has.
I think Matthew would just make the finishing touches and announce the next of the seminars.
Yeah, okay. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you so much, Eric, as always, for being our our host and compere for the evening. Just to say that the next event is Tuesday, the 16th of February at 5 p.m. And William Mann, who is probably still here in the audience, William is our speaker, and his presentation will be on untimely buildings. And hopefully, in the way that Carolyn has tonight, the build-up of the conversation we're having will enrich the discussion that we have on that evening. So thanks all very much for coming. It's great to see you all, and thanks, Robert, for introducing Carolyn. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. It's been really lovely to see you all. I can feel a plan for a party formulating as I look at all your lovely faces. I want to have a festival, as Christian said. So we'll make that happen in the summer, as soon as the virus lets us.
Thank you, Carolyn. Great.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed
Bye.
it. Thank you very much. Bye. Brilliant.